In 1977, Elvis Presley was mid-performance, in front of 22,000 screaming fans, when he suddenly stopped singing and locked eyes with a man in the crowd, the same man who had mercilessly bullied him as a vulnerable child in Mississippi. The entire arena fell silent as these two men stared at each other across decades of pain and fame, with thousands of witnesses holding their breath. But what Elvis did next, in that moment of raw, unfiltered emotion, would you choose revenge or something far more powerful if you came face to face with the person who tormented you when you were powerless? The backstage corridors of the International Hotel reeked of stale cigarette smoke and nervous sweat. It was August 1977, and the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls as crew members scurried past with equipment and clipboards. Elvis stood motionless in his dressing room, his famous white jumpsuit catching the light from the vanity mirrors that surrounded him like a fortress of bulbs. The sequins and rhinestones that adorned the fabric seemed to weigh heavier than usual against his shoulders. Through the thin walls, the rumble of 22,000 voices created a constant, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floor and up into his chest. The sound was both familiar and foreign. He had heard crowds like this 1,000 times before, but tonight something felt different. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the small television monitor that showed the audience from various angles. Row upon row of eager faces stared back at him, their mouths moving in animated conversation, their eyes bright with anticipation. The air conditioning unit rattled incessantly in the corner, fighting a losing battle against the desert heat that seeped through the building's walls. Ice clinked in glasses as waitresses prepared for the evening service, their high heels clicking against the polished floors in rhythmic patterns that echoed through the hallways. The scent of hairspray and cologne mingled with the aroma of kitchen grease from the hotel's restaurant, creating an atmosphere that was uniquely Las Vegas artificial yet intoxicating. Charlie Hodge knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission, as was his custom. 5 minutes, EP, he announced, but his voice carried a note of concern. Elvis had been quieter than usual during the sound check, more withdrawn. The pills that helped him sleep had left him groggy, and the pills that helped him perform had left him jittery. It was a cycle that had become as routine as his stage entrance. Charlie noticed the way Elvis gripped the edge of the vanity table, his knuckles white against the dark wood, his breathing shallow and irregular. Elvis nodded but didn't turn away from the monitor. Something had caught his attention in the crowd, a face that seemed familiar yet impossible. The camera angle shifted, and for a moment he lost sight of it. His breathing became more labored as he leaned closer to the screen, his blue eyes scanning the sea of strangers for that one face that had triggered something deep in his memory. The television screen flickered slightly, the black and white image wavering, as if the past were trying to break through into the present. The dressing room door opened again, and his bodyguards entered, their presence filling the small space with an air of protective authority. They had noticed his distraction, the way his usual pre-show energy had been replaced by something else entirely. Red West approached cautiously, knowing that Elvis could be unpredictable when something was troubling him. The man they protected had moods that could shift like desert weather, calm one moment, stormy the next. Outside, the crowd's energy continued to build like pressure in a kettle. Programs rustled, ice clinked in glasses, and conversations grew louder as showtime approached. The anticipation was electric, almost tangible, as if the very air in the venue had been charged with excitement. Women adjusted their makeup in compact mirrors, hoping to catch Elvis's eye from the audience. Men loosened their ties, preparing to lose themselves in the music. Children fidgeted in their seats, wide-eyed at the prospect of seeing the legend their parents revered. But in the quiet sanctuary of his dressing room, Elvis remained frozen, his eyes still searching the monitor for confirmation of what he thought he had seen, a ghost from his past that had no business being in his present. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking the seconds until he would have to transform from the troubled man in the mirror into the king his audience expected to see. The face on the monitor belonged to Tommy Morrison, though Elvis hadn't spoken that name aloud in over 20 years. Tommy had been 3 years older and 40 pounds heavier when they were children in Tupelo, Mississippi. He had been the kind of boy who found pleasure in making others smaller. And Elvis, with his soft-spoken manner and unusual devotion to music, had been an easy target. The memories flooded back with unexpected clarity, being pushed against the brick wall of the school building, having his lunch money stolen, being mocked for the way he sang gospel songs under his breath. Those Tupelo days felt like scenes from someone else's life now, yet they remained vivid in ways that his recent performances had begun to blur together. Elvis could still smell the chalk dust in Miss Grimes's classroom, still feel the rough texture of his hand-me-down shirts, still hear his mother's voice calling him in for supper, while Tommy and his friends threw rocks at their front porch. The Morrison boy had been relentless in his cruelty, seeming to take particular pleasure in targeting the quiet kid who preferred books to baseball, music to mischief. Elvis closed his eyes and felt 14 years old again, small and powerless, watching helplessly as Tommy tore up the sheet music he had copied by hand from the radio. The humiliation had burned then, and it burned now, even through the layers of fame and success that should have insulated him from such ancient pain. His mother's voice echoed in his memory, telling him to turn the other cheek, to be the bigger person. But at 14, being the bigger person had felt impossible when you were already the smaller one. Gladys Presley had bandaged his scraped knees and wounded pride with equal tenderness, never knowing that those childhood battles would follow her son into adulthood. Now, at 42, Elvis carried the weight of being the king everywhere he went. The title that had once thrilled him now felt like a burden, a costume he couldn't remove even in private moments. The constant pressure to be larger than life, to embody the dreams and fantasies of millions, had taken its toll on his body and spirit. His marriage to Priscilla had ended in divorce that still stung. His relationship with his daughter, Lisa Marie, was strained by his erratic schedule and unpredictable moods, and his health was declining faster than he wanted to admit to himself or anyone else. The pills that helped him sleep often left him groggy for performances, while the ones that gave him energy for the stage made it impossible to rest afterward. It was a pharmaceutical tightrope walk that his doctor assured him was manageable, but Elvis knew better. He could feel his body betraying him with each passing month, the shortness of breath that came too easily, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the bloating that made even his custom-made jumpsuits feel tight. The mirror reflected a face that was still handsome, but showed the strain of trying to be superhuman for too many years. His inner circle had grown smaller and more protective, building walls around him that kept out both danger and honesty. They told him what they thought he wanted to hear, agreed with his increasingly erratic decisions, and enabled habits that they all knew were destructive. The isolation was suffocating, even surrounded by people who claimed to love him. Sometimes he wondered if any of them saw him as a person rather than a commodity to be managed and protected. Standing in that dressing room, staring at Tommy Morrison's middle-aged face in the crowd, Elvis felt the collision of his past vulnerability and present struggles. The boy who had been bullied and the man who had conquered the world were somehow the same person, and the disconnect was jarring. His hands shook not just from the medication, but from the emotional earthquake of seeing someone who represented his deepest insecurities sitting among his most devoted fans. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had once made him feel powerless was now paying money to watch him perform. Charlie knocked again, more insistently this time. "It's time, Elvis." The crowd's roar had grown louder, more impatient, and the band was already in position on stage. But Elvis remained transfixed by the monitor, his mind racing through decades of triumph and pain, wondering if the man in seat 247 remembered their shared history, and more importantly, What he would do with this unexpected opportunity for a reckoning that he had never imagined would come. The stage lights blazed like miniature suns as Elvis strode into their glare, his white jumpsuit catching and reflecting the beams in thousands of tiny sparkles. The crowd erupted in a wave of sound that seemed to lift the roof of the International Hotel. He moved through his opening numbers with practiced precision, his voice strong and commanding, but his eyes kept searching the audience for seat 247. The familiar choreography felt mechanical tonight, as if he were watching himself perform from somewhere outside his body. Halfway through Love Me Tender, Elvis found him again. Tommy Morrison sat perfectly still while everyone around him swayed and sang along. Their eyes met across the vast expanse of the auditorium, and time seemed to fracture. The backing vocals continued behind Elvis, but his own voice faltered for just a moment, a barely perceptible hesitation that only the most devoted fans might notice. But Tommy noticed. Even from that distance, Elvis could see recognition dawn on the older man's face. The music swelled around them, but Elvis felt as though he were trapped in a bubble of silence. Tommy's expression was unreadable, not hostile, but not friendly either, just present, watchful. The same calculating look he had worn as a 12-year-old, deciding whether to push Elvis down or merely take his lunch money. The neutrality of it was somehow worse than outright antagonism would have been. Elvis finished the song and moved into his usual banter with the audience, but his words came out stilted, disconnected. The crowd didn't seem to notice, laughing at his jokes and cheering at the appropriate moments, but his band members exchanged glances. Something was off. Charlie Hodge stepped closer, guitar in hand, ready to fill any awkward pauses, but Elvis waved him back with an almost imperceptible gesture. "You know," Elvis said into the microphone, his voice carrying that familiar Memphis drawl that could make even casual conversation sound intimate. "Sometimes you think you've left your past behind, but it has a way of catching up with you." The crowd murmured appreciatively, assuming this was leading to another song or story. But Elvis's eyes remained locked on Tommy Morrison, who had leaned forward slightly in his seat, as if he too sensed that this moment was about more than entertainment. The silence stretched longer than it should have. 22,000 people began to shift uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something unusual happening, but unable to identify what it was. The band waited, instruments poised, unsure whether to continue with the planned set list or improvise. Even the waitresses stopped serving drinks, their attention drawn to the stage where Elvis Presley stood frozen, staring into the crowd with an intensity that seemed to burn through the air itself. Tommy Morrison slowly stood up, his movement visible even from the stage because of the spotlight that happened to be illuminating his section. The people around him turned to look, some annoyed that he was blocking their view, others curious about what had caught Elvis's attention. The two men faced each other across decades of history, across the vast gulf between fame and anonymity, across the unbridgeable distance between the stage and seat 247, while thousands of witnesses held their breath without understanding why. Elvis stepped away from the microphone stand, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the electric tension crackling through the air. The stage lights followed him as he walked to the very edge of the platform, close enough that the people in the front rows could see the individual rhinestones on his jumpsuit, close enough that they could read the expression on his face. What they saw there wasn't the confident smirk of the king or the practiced charm of the entertainer. It was something rawer, more human. He raised his hand, not in his typical greeting gesture, but in a small, almost tentative wave directed specifically at Tommy Morrison. The crowd followed his gaze, turning in their seats to look at the man who had somehow captured Elvis Presley's complete attention. Tommy stood perfectly still for a moment, clearly stunned that he had been singled out, then slowly raised his own hand in response. The gesture was awkward, uncertain, but unmistakably real. Elvis returned to the microphone, but instead of resuming the planned set list, he did something unprecedented. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice softer now, more contemplative. "I'd like to dedicate this next song to everyone who helped make us who we are today. The teachers who believed in us, the friends who stood by us, and yes, even the people who challenged us when we were young." He paused, his eyes finding Tommy again. "Sometimes the people who push us the hardest, even when we don't want to be pushed, help us find strength we didn't know we had." The opening notes of "He Touched Me" began to play, but Elvis had transformed the gospel standard into something entirely different. His voice carried a weight of forgiveness that seemed to settle over the entire audience like a blessing. As he sang about redemption and grace, his eyes kept returning to Tommy Morrison, who had sat back down but remained transfixed, his face showing the kind of emotion that middle-aged men usually tried to hide. The crowd sensed they were witnessing something extraordinary, though most couldn't understand exactly what. The energy in the room had shifted from excitement to something deeper, a communal recognition that they were watching a moment of profound human connection unfold before them. Some people began to cry without knowing why. Others reached for the hands of strangers sitting nearby, caught up in the unexpected intimacy of what they were experiencing. When the song ended, Elvis bowed his head for a moment, gathering himself. Then he looked up at Tommy Morrison one final time and smiled, not the rehearsed smile of a performer, but the genuine expression of a man who had chosen grace over grudges, forgiveness over revenge. Tommy Morrison wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, no longer the intimidating bully from a Mississippi schoolyard, but simply another human being, touched by an act of unexpected mercy. The show continued for another hour, but everyone knew they had witnessed the real performance in those few minutes, when Elvis Presley had stripped away his legendary persona and revealed the man underneath. As the crowd filed out into the Nevada night, they carried with them the memory of a moment when someone famous enough to destroy his childhood tormentor had instead chosen to offer him redemption, transforming both men and everyone who witnessed it in the process.